Welcome to Let's Talk Poli.
Hello, guys. This is our first ever edition. We're gonna call it Season 1, Episode 1 episode, if that works. Is that a thing?
That's not a thing.
All right. Well, let's move on to what we're actually here to do. As Rebecca mentioned, the podcast is called Let's Talk Poli. Also part of the letstalkpoli.com website. Do note that there is no apostrophe in the URL. And we'll just we'll do a quick intro as to what actually are we trying to do here, because that's probably what you're wondering now that we're about 30 seconds into this. So before you just skip to the next episode of Pot Save America or something along those lines, Rebecca, can you tell everybody here, or whoever is listening, should they be listening, what we're all about?
I shall. So basically, Nikita and I have been friends for a very long time. We've gone through life together. We've had great conversations. We've met interesting people. And I think we both share a passion to learn, and to learn through conversation, learn through dialogue, and to just meet really crazy, fascinating people along the way.
And also spend hours on end talking about
Politics. What else?
And because you have me, who's basically a microbiology grad, who's looking to get a poli-science degree without actually going to university for that.
Yep.
And Rebecca, can you tell us a bit about your backstory?
My backstory. I am
as briefly as it can be.
I am a current student, now 26 years old. Went back to school to finish my undergrad after meandering for 5 years. So I am studying international development, and have a background in lots of politics work, lots of international development, some art in there. Basically, I'm someone who likes to talk to people and likes to learn.
Yeah, basically going back to school for something that you already know from working in the field.
I do. But there's a reason I went back to school.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's always good to have a reason to go back.
It's not always obvious, but there's a reason.
Yeah, there's.
So Nikita, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so as I said, I graduated from microbiology and immunology from McGill, and then was looking for work, and there wasn't much happening in Montreal. Decided to uproot myself and move over to London. Ended up working in tech, moving from sales to product development, which led me to foreign parts to me of this world.
And so where were you living for the past year?
I lived in Manila for the past year, did everything I wanted to do at my old job, left, back now in Montreal, but it's
time to start a podcast.
Yeah, I was like, you know what? I want to get a poli-sci degree, but how am I going to pay for that? So,
how am I not going to pay for that?
Yeah, exactly. So, bought a bit of equipment to record a podcast, and now inviting everybody I know to chat with me about politics and teach me a thing or two.
And so, where do you see this podcast going? What's the plan?
I think we've been talking about this for about a week now. I've been playing with this thought for maybe about 6 months. And generally, I think I just want to talk to people that I know, people that are authorities in their field. And as I said that word, everybody should note that I cannot pronounce the THs for my life. So if you're inclined to write that in the comments, just don't. Don't. Say something nice instead.
Hey, a little lisp is
exactly. I mean,
pretty damn
call
cute.
It a sexy lisp.
There we go.
So yeah, I think where this is going to go, I think we're going to try to get people in that know more than we do, or know the same amounts that we do in certain fields, and have a chat with them. And I think we're also going to try to get friends of ours
who think, who are critical, who like to analyze and who challenge us to think differently about things that we think are important.
Yeah, because I think at the end of the day, we're living in this world where echo chamber is a buzzword.
Yeah.
And I think it's a buzzword for a very valid reason. I think we all know the Breitbarts of this world, but also a non so obvious echo chamber is, what kind of friends we have on Facebook, what kind of
our bubbles
content. Yeah, our little community bubbles that we build both online and offline. And I think this is going to be one of those platforms where, that's a buzzword, one of those places where people can go to hopefully hear diverse opinions.
So this is not going to be a safe space. This is going to be a space where we challenge ourselves to learn and to look from other people's points of view.
It's going to be a safe space to challenge. Let's go with that.
Okay.
We don't want people running away yet, do we?
No, we don't.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's how we're gonna approach things. And yeah, we've been working out of B21 at McGill, inspired from the B20 building at MIT. If you don't know what that is, I would suggest Googling, because that's exactly what I did when somebody told me about it about 2 weeks ago. And I think we've met quite a few interesting people there.
And we'll bring you along into those conversations.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to record from that space. It is right at the corner of two fairly busy streets, but hopefully the inside is soundproof enough that we can actually record something audible. We've had quite a few fun conversations, interesting conversations, and at times challenging conversations. And I think hopefully we can bring those to whoever is listening to this. Friends and family, thank you very much. Now get your friends and family to listen to it too. However, this week we're actually bringing you an interview by the very same somebody who introduced me to B21.
And who is this somebody?
That somebody is actually, his name is Gautham Krishnaraj. The question, I guess, now is, how do I know him? I met Gautham because we both study microbiology and immunology. He is 2 years younger than I am, yet very much an inspiration to me. And I think the interview will actually tell you exactly why he is such an amazing person. Rebecca, I think you met him just last week. What were your thoughts?
Gautham is incredibly articulate, incredibly sensitive to what's going on politically in the region he's been working in. As you will hear, he just came back from a year working in Kenya, in Mombasa, for the Agha Khan Foundation. He's going to touch on his personal background, his education, what led him to relocate to Mombasa for a year. I'm sure you might be familiar with the political climate in Kenya these days. It's been very tense. It's been a good amount of uproar surrounding the elections, and he had direct experience with that, which he'll tell you about. And so we look at his lens, and his lens is global health, and how global health and political, social issues are extremely interconnected.
And without further ado,
yeah, my name is Gautham Krishnaraj. I currently work with Humanitarian U, which is a provider of humanitarian blended learning programs. I hold a Master's of Science in Global Health. I wrote my thesis on humanitarian ethics, and bachelor's from McGill University in microbiology and immunology, which is where I met Nikita.
Indeed, he did. Can you actually tell us a bit about where we're sitting in right now? Because as I understand, we're actually at your job. So if you could give us a bit of context on what you're up to right now.
Yeah, so we're in a bit of an interesting boardroom right now. It's at our Humanitarian U offices in Montreal, and kind of around us is all of the things that we need to pull off a humanitarian disaster simulation. So we've got a bunch of radios, a fake dead baby doll, a bunch of pennies, what else do we have? A bunch of costumes, military regalia, and things like that. So yeah, basically we're running a simulation with Johns Hopkins University as well as Project Hope, the NGO in the United States, next week. We have a faculty of about 20 experienced humanitarian healthcare workers who come down and provide their expertise in in terms of a lecture, as well as running this 3-day simulation, which contains various skills that you might need in order to deploy as a humanitarian worker in any disaster context.
Pretty sweet. Sounds pretty exciting. Honestly, this looks like a massive mess, the room that we're in. I wouldn't call it a conference room, but it's quite a collection of items in here. So based on your experience and based on what you actually know, can you give us a broad overview of the issues at play in Africa in the context of public health, which is broadly what you studied during your master's? So yeah, I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, so one of the other things I've been doing over the past year, I was a fellow with the Agha Khan Foundation of Canada, and I was working with the Madrasa Early Childhood Program in Kenya and working on several projects throughout East Africa. So my expertise and recent experience pertains mostly to East Africa, so I'll speak to that. The recent political situation in Kenya was particularly interesting with the two elections, the two presidential elections in 2017. And we saw a lot of issues. So Madrasa Early Childhood Program works in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And we have a number of programs both that are community-based, so we go out into extremely rural settings and work with counselors and go into people's homes and work with them to understand what they need to ensure the proper brain development of their babies, proper stimulation, nutrition, things like that. But also we work with governments, with hospitals, and over the course of the last year in Kenya, we saw a lot of challenges working with nurses because they were on strike for several months. So we weren't really able to carry out a lot of our programming. And I think that's one of the main challenges that I have faced over this past year in trying to deliver programming is the unforeseen consequences of any major political changes or movement in developing nations on every service that's delivered, whether that's education, healthcare, just infrastructure development. It really all comes grinding to a complete halt.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like it's quite exciting to be working in that kind of environment. But something you touched upon already. Can you just develop a bit more on how this policy actually affect the different approaches that you might take to public health across a continent, or just more broadly, whether in Africa or on other continents as well?
Policy in terms of what?
So, for example, like in Kenya, there were a lot of issues around the elections. Actually, is that a point that you could elaborate a bit more on what happened around the elections?
Yeah, for sure. So for those of you who don't know, the first Kenyan presidential election of 2017 took place on August 8th. And it was between basically two old foes, Raila Odinga from the Orange Democratic Movement, or NASA, and Jomo Kenyatta, who was the president prior and was quote unquote reelected. So yeah, basically they had the election on August 8th. And in a surprising turn of events, the Supreme Court annulled it based on a petition by Raila Odinga and the NASA coalition, based on the premise that there was some sort of voter fraud. There were basically NASA ran their own independent audit of the election and found massive discrepancies between what they believed to be the voter turnout, and what was reported by the IEBC, the Independent Electoral Body in Kenya. And so the Supreme Court annulled it. It was a landmark ruling, and there was another election that was held shortly after that. And basically, Raila Odinga called on all of his supporters to completely boycott the election. And the turnout was that Jomo Kenyatta won with, I believe it was 93 or 97% of the vote. And if you look at other leaders in the African continent who have been voted in with 97% of the vote, it's not a group that you want to be a part of in any way whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. We can see where that kind of trend might be going. Can while you were in Kenya, did you notice any sort of the international backlash, or what was the international reaction, or were you quite isolated from it while in the country?
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few international bodies that were calling for both the Kenyan people and for both major political parties and presidential candidates to stand down, to not have a repeat of past election violence. There was a lot of tension prior to the August 8th, the first Kenyan election last year, just because in previous years we've seen hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes, a lot of violence. I think this year, this past election cycle, there were a couple hundred deaths over, again, a very extended election period. So comparatively, it was not as bad as previous years. I think it was interesting to see how Odinga, specifically the opposition leader, was engaging with the international, with several actors in the international sector. I think he delivered a speech at Chatham House between the two elections in the UK. And there's also been a role for Canada even. One of the senior officials within the IEBC, that's the Electoral Commission in Kenya, is a dual Kenyan-Canadian citizen, and he basically fled to Canada, and there was another one who fled to the US basically on threat of violence following the elections.
So amongst all of this excitement, if we could so call it, in the country, how did you feel in the country, and how were you actually dealing with it on a day-to-day basis? Were you in the country? Were you evacuated? And subsequently, if you were brought back in, how was that decided?
Yeah, so it was interesting. Historically, Mombasa, where I was based, has been known as a more dangerous city, especially between Nairobi and Kenya. Mombasa is kind of the port city. It's a working class area of Kenya, and the interesting thing was that for this election, Raila Odinga pretty much has a stronghold in Mombasa. So all of the election violence happens where there's somewhat equal proportions of both opposition and supporters of the party in power. So Mombasa was relatively calm. That being said, in the previous election, where there was quite a bit of violence, some of my colleagues were saying that people were running outside of our office holding like bodies in their arms. So it has been a change. The only time I really came face to face with any protests was while I was in Nairobi one of the weekends. And for the most part, they are peaceful. The interesting thing about all of these protests is the party in power, supporters of the party in power, tend to be also in better jobs. They have jobs, first of all, and then they're in higher government jobs or within business. And so they don't really have the time or energy to invest in coming out to protest. But if you look at Raila Odinga's supporters, a lot of them are from these poorer areas of Kenya. He himself kind of, his initial rise in politics came when he was representing a district that holds quite a large slum as well. So most of his support base, or a lot of his support base, have the time and energy to invest in coming out to protest. So that's another aspect that people don't really consider. They think, okay, why aren't Jomo Kenyatta's supporters so enthusiastic about ensuring that their president stays in power? They are, but they know that they need to go run their store, otherwise they can't eat that week. Whereas Odinga's supporters, it's stay home and kind of do nothing, or come out and protest and try and gain your right and support your presidential candidate.
Quite a complex situation going on there. Can you actually just let us know, when did you leave, and what was the status of the country, and what is it at the minute now?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't answer your question about being evacuated. So I was, for the second election, August 8th, I arrived shortly after that. We were actually held in Canada until the first election passed, and then we were surprised by the Supreme Court ruling. So yeah, I was there for the second election. I was evacuated quote unquote, again, I didn't really see any unrest in Mombasa itself, but we have offices in Kampala and Zanzibar. So naturally, I chose to go for my evacuation to Zanzibar and worked out of our office there for three weeks, which was a nice challenge to have. And I returned from Kenya back to Montreal just a few weeks ago, and just before I left, it seemed as though Odinga and Kenyatta have come to some sort of an accord. They seem to be working together more amicably than in the past few months. This, of course, is drawing the ire of Odinga supporters saying that he's giving up, and it's a tough position. Like, both of these are the two big political families in Kenya, right? Like, Kenyatta, the current president, his father was the first president of Kenya. He's on the back of all the currency. And Odinga, his father, was the first vice president of Kenya. So both of them are heavily invested. Their families started as partners and have kind of split from there. And it's been slowly devolving into chaos every time these two candidates go against each other.
All right. Well, thanks for the sort of history lesson, or the brief history lesson of the current situation in Kenya. Now the ultimate question: where do you actually see Kenya specifically going forward, from a sort of political calm standpoint, but also if you could potentially add a public health policy, how could that? Is there any potential for improvements there?
Yeah, I mean, again, coming from someone who only spent about a year in Kenya, I'm by no means an expert on the topic, but if I could say my ideal vision for Kenya would be for it to take the route of Tanzania. So a lot of the challenges in the election, or I would say the main challenge in the election, is this continual tribalism that exists within Kenya. And if you look just to the south in Tanzania, the president, who's again now in some hot water, did bring in this ideology of you are Tanzanian first, and you can keep your tribal allegiances, but by no means will those tribal ancestry or tribal allegiances play a role in your ability to succeed and thrive within the Tanzanian economy and society. And so Kenya hasn't reached that point, and I don't know that there is a critical mass of the population or the political will to make that happen. Again, Kenyatta and his tribe and associated tribes, I guess, are the ones who hold a lot of these government jobs. Every time there's a major infrastructure project, the contracts go to those tribes. And so there's a lot of there are many deep-rooted issues here that tie to these politics. And I think if they're able to step past this tribalism and see themselves as Kenyan first, I think that would be an incredible step forward for Kenya as a country.
All right, that's quite interesting. So basically bringing Kenya under one roof, one nation, basically. Basically that's what it is. All right, so if I remember correctly, before I actually moved abroad from Montreal, you had a little hand in working within the Ebola crisis. Is that right? And if so, can you just elaborate what the hell were you up to? And how did you contribute to solving the crisis?
I would say that contributing to solving the crisis would be quite a large statement for what little piece I did have to do with it. But I was, again, happy to do it. So a little bit of background, that was when I was still at McGill studying microbiology and immunology. And during the days, I was taking virology classes, learning about the kind of pathophysiology of Ebola virus. And then by night, I was working on contract for the International Medical Corps, helping develop basically personal protective equipment protocols, training protocols, to be delivered to the front line in Sierra Leone. So basically that was some branding work, making sure that all the documents were consistent in style and language, and that evolved into actually doing research for both international and domestic protocols. So looking at even some of the hospitals in Montreal, if Ebola was to come to domestic shores, how would we handle it? And it was kind of daunting to see how unprepared a lot of our domestic health systems would be for something like that, despite the fact that the vaccine, or one of the major vaccines that was being developed during the crisis, was coming out of the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg. So yeah, it was an interesting time. It was cool to see. It's not every day that a microbiology student gets to see what they study on the news every night. So it was definitely an interesting time.
Cool. And from that experience, because that was a major crisis, that was very well publicized, and as you said, it was in the news basically every single night for a period of a couple months, I believe. What did you learn about the local authorities' capacity to actually deal with such a crisis? And by local, I do mean the nations that were affected, most affected.
So I think with any international response like this, the UN mechanisms, the NGO mechanisms are meant to come in when local capacity is overwhelmed. So the fact that the IMC, the International Medical Corps, was involved, the fact that Médecins Sans Frontières were involved, that was because the hospitals could not handle it on their own. There was obviously a lot of criticism of how long it took for the WHO mechanisms to come into place. That's a whole nother podcast series in and of itself. I think one of the things that people often forget is, despite the fact that local capacity is overwhelmed, they are the first people on the ground. Like, it isn't the humanitarians that deploy from Western nations to these low and middle income countries that are the first people on the ground. No, there's an entire system of local MSF, local Red Cross, local every NGO, all these like smaller grassroots organizations. They're the first people who are really dealing with this. So there's tremendous capacity, but even when that isn't enough is when we come in, when they need either specialized training or specialized support. In the case of the Ebola crisis, I think that one of the biggest issues was that we weren't working close enough with local NGOs and local partners, because we were kind of ignoring a lot of the social side of Ebola. It took quite a long time for us to realize that it was the washing and kissing of bodies that was actually the cause of the disease progressing and having so many more cases. And if we had seen that earlier, I think that there would have been a bigger intervention earlier in terms of making sure that the families were able to respect their past loved ones, but not kind of going forward with those traditional death and burial practices, and therefore cutting short it would have cut short the crisis, in my opinion. What was it like in the UK? Were you in the UK by the time Ebola was hitting international media waves?
That's a good question. When was Ebola, like, date-wise? Do you remember?
Like 2014, 2015?
2014, 2015. I think I was still... Because I had moved to the UK March 2015. So I think I was on the tail end of the Ebola crisis. I didn't quite get as much of the coverage. Although I do actually remember, because I was in Canada, and still in Canada. You know, we get CNN, so we get the American coverage. It was just on a whole other level. It was as if it was the end of the world, which understandably it could have been if it wasn't managed properly, and that's I think why public health policy is quite important. That's I think why we're discussing it at the minute. Whereas in the UK it was a lot more sort of subdued, and it was, the whole news cycle was far more rational about it, that rather than emotional. But I don't think that is only relating to Ebola, but I think it's more of a general general theme in the U.S. news cycle.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you kind of touch on a good point there, that public health policy, like, again, I studied global health, and I see, like, it's basically, you can't separate public and global health, right? Especially in today's day and age, like, something that's happening in rural Sierra Leone can be on our doorstep in Montreal or in London in less than 24 hours. There's just such intense global exchange in terms of goods and people. Well, not the exchange of people, but the traveling and movement of people. That, yeah, when we think about public health in Canada, we have to be considering our contributions to health internationally and to researching diseases like Ebola. That's why I think it's incredible for the Canadian image on the international stage that we were researching Ebola and had that ZMapp vaccine, I believe, already in research, already in trials in Winnipeg. And when the crisis struck, we were able to be one of the lead teams and delivering those kind of trial vaccines on the ground.
So would you say that actually Canada is doing its fair share for public health policy on a global scale? And also, is public health policy should be one of national security policy?
I think it's hard to say that Canada is doing everything it should be for anything internationally right now. We've had a goal set for more than a decade, or probably even longer, of hitting 0.7% of GDP as our overseas development investment, and we haven't hit that number. We're not even close. I think we're at like 0.27, and I believe it was either the Pearson report, or there was a report that was spearheaded by Canada saying that nations should aim for this figure of 0.7%, and some of the Nordic countries have reached it. Some of them, I believe, one or two have surpassed it, and we have not even reached our own goal. And that just doesn't look good internationally. And any investments that we would be making in global health and health internationally would fall under that ODI 0.7 figure.
Yeah, quite some figures and names you're throwing around there. So I'm not going to take up much more of Gautam's time. He is at work. But I'm going to put him on the spot here and just ask 5 fun facts about himself. Because at the end of the day, we are talking about getting in touch with people around you who might know stuff that you might not know about, be engaging in basically policy conversations with your surroundings. Well, with the people surrounding you. If you want to be talking to the trees around you, that's up to you. So I just want you to realize that at the end of the day, that the people around you might know a lot of stuff, but they're also just as fun and actually humans, and not just Google search engines. So here we go for 5 fun facts about Gautam, or 5 fun stories, whichever we want. I don't know. This is the first run at it, so we'll see what it goes.
All right, let's go for 5 rapid fire facts. Fact 1, I'm on a lifelong mission to find the world's best strawberry milkshake. Fact 2, I was a sous chef and opened a restaurant in the Okanagan Valley a few years ago. Fact 3, I've run 2 ultra marathons. Fact 4, I have 2 first-degree black belts. And let's see, fact 5, this is always the hardest one. I hiked the Simeon Mountains in Ethiopia earlier this year, and I had my first travel advisory that I actually heeded, and that was going to the Danakil Depression, which is the lowest point on Earth. But there are some indigenous populations there that are known to castrate their enemies with a long curved knife. And upon reading that, I decided, let's not go there.
I think that might have been your most wise decision that you have ever made since I've known you. And finally, what is your next destination? What are you working on? in the coming 6 months to a year?
Yeah, so I'm heading to Virginia next week to run a simulation, as I mentioned, with Johns Hopkins, Project Hope, Massachusetts General Hospital's Global Disaster Response Team, and of course Humanitarian U, who I work for. Following that, we'll be running a similar simulation with University of Laval in Quebec City. I'll be working for Grand Challenges Canada in their innovation marketplace for the Every Woman, Every Child initiative for a 4-month contract following that, and then starting a PhD in health policy at McMaster University. So it's a busy couple months ahead.
You know, just casually doing all of that. And finally, do you want people to get in touch with you?
I mean,
All right, so for those listening, where can they get in touch with you?
you can just shoot me an email. It'll be in the link with Nikita's podcast.
Yeah, we'll make that happen.
All right, dude. Thanks. It's nice talking to you.
Thank you, Gautham. Thanks for your time.
So that wasn't bad for first interview.
Yeah, I think that was pretty good. I think there's a lot more material to come from of this nature, but also discussions. And I think Gautham's insights were absolutely incredible. You know, he was on the ground, he was there to experience it, but also his experience from not being on the ground and actually helping out with that Ebola crisis in 2014. I think, as I said, you guys probably understand why I find him to be so inspirational. And I think that's kind of what I like a lot of people to take away is this is just a very close friend of mine, and you have to realize that, you know, look around your surroundings, look at your entourage, and you'll probably realize that there are people around you who know quite a bit about quite a few different subjects. They might not cover all of the subjects. I certainly don't have enough of an entourage to know everything in the world, but I certainly know that I can reach out to them to learn a few more new things. Did you learn something new, Rebecca?
Well, I really appreciated Gautham's insight. I appreciated his, he spoke frankly to us before we did the interview, and he was pretty honest. His experience with his professional experience was complicated. There was a lot that they couldn't do. Their hands were tied off a lot of the time on the ground. And I think that forced him to reconsider how one operates in the public health sector and what social and political implications make a big difference in how medical care is accessed locally. So there's a big difference between the theory of how we approach global health and what's actually going on the ground. And Gautham's going to go off and have an amazing career, and we wish him all the best.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if everybody, including whoever's listening, actually hears his name in the news a lot more in the coming years. I think he's been up to some incredible work, and is going to be doing some incredible work. So again, this is the type of thing that I think you could expect from us. Sometimes I'll be interviewing, sometimes Rebecca will be interviewing, sometimes the both of us will be in it. We're going into this with a bit of a open-ended,
naive
question.
Eagerness.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot.
Okay.
So yeah, again, this was the first episode of the Let's Talk Poli podcast, season 1, episode 1. Come and talk to us, whether it's in the comments or talk to us on the website letstalkpoly.com without the apostrophe. Find us on Facebook, find us on Instagram, because Rebecca thinks that we don't have that, but we do. We do. Again, if you like what you heard, come back next week. We'll have some more content for you, and don't forget to potentially leave a like or a comment. Rebecca, any last words for this first episode?
Thanks for bearing with us. We really appreciate you tuning in, and we have lots more in store.
Yes, and please listen to it.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great week, everybody, and get your friends and tell them, let's talk Poli.